Hi, good morning. We're going to have a panel discussion about the debt, but also about this week and what Congress will or will not be doing. We're going to have some Q&A up here, and then we're going to have some Q&A with the audience. Let me first ask you guys, how many people here think we're going to have a partial government shutdown this fall? 1, 2. Oh, like half the room, would you say? How many people think we'll have a partial default on our debt at some point this fall? Meaning you pay some obligations, but not others. Sorry. Okay, so not too many people. All right. And how many people think that the negative effects of either a shutdown or a default are overblown? One person.
Brave person.
One person. Okay, so I just wanted to get the temperature because that's really what everyone's talking about here. Let me go ahead and introduce the panelists, starting from our right, quite literally. We have Derrick Morgan, who is the Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. Previously, he worked right here on Capitol Hill, serving as the domestic policy expert for the Republican Policy Committee in the Senate. Before that, he worked for 4 years as staff secretary to Vice President Dick Cheney and also served as legal counsel for the Office of the Vice President. Heritage's political arm, as you know, we were just talking about this, is very active in pushing the defunding and delay of Obamacare in the context of funding of the government, and if that doesn't work in terms of the debt ceiling. I asked Derrick if he agrees with that position. He does. He also wrote a piece about the debt ceiling in January and thought that lawmakers should not raise it unless they pass immediate reforms to have a balanced budget within 10 years.
How many people think we're going to defund Obamacare in the next 3 months?
You're not the moderator.
I just want to be a pest.
You're taking polls?
How many people think yeah, nobody. So mostly one person. One person.
You didn't even raise it up.
Okay. But a lot of people think we're going to shut the government down. So, okay, we'll work on that. To Derrick's left, quite literally as well, is Jared Bernstein. He's senior fellow at the Liberal Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. For the first 3 years of the Obama administration, he served as chief economist and economic advisor to the vice president, Joe Biden. He also headed up the White House task force on the middle class and was a member of President Obama's economic team. Prior to that, he was a senior economist and director of the Living Standards Program at the Liberal Economic Policy Institute. He has many areas of expertise, among them income inequality and mobility. And in recent congressional testimony, he advocated for the reduction or repeal of tax expenditures and to use at least some of the money saved for deficit reduction. Straddling the middle is Jim, who might talk in the middle of everything, I don't know. He is the senior vice president for policy and a co-founder of the centrist think tank Third Way. He worked on the Hill for 12 years as a Democratic congressional staffer, most notably working as legislative director for Chuck Schumer of New York and Senator Chuck Schumer and Congressman Chet Atkins of Massachusetts. He's written a lot of position papers for Third Way, one of which I think was offered out there called The 4 Fiscal Fantasies, which sounds like a good bedtime story, but is not. It is. I like what he laid out, though. His 4 fiscal fantasies are taxing the rich solves all our problems. We can have it all. We can have a bigger safety net and more investments that spur growth. No problem. Let's just do it all. Delaying entitlement fixes will be perfectly benign for the middle class. And fantasy number 4, and this is my absolute favorite, politics to fix entitlements will totally get better at some point. Just not now. To his left is Diana Furchtgott-Roth. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank. She's also a contributing editor of RealClearMarkets.com, a columnist for the Washington Examiner, MarketWatch.com, and Tax Notes. She's also worked for lots of Republican presidents. From 2000. But that's a lot. I mean, it's hard to work for one president, let alone 3. Anyway, I thought it was impressive. From 2003 to 2005, she was chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor under George Bush. Prior to that, she served as chief of staff of his Council of Economic Advisors. She also worked for his dad in the early 90s, serving as deputy executive director of the Domestic Policy Council in the White House. Earlier in her career, she worked as an economist for President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Her areas of expertise are many, and they include employment, taxation, pensions, unionization, and immigration. And then we have MacGuineas, who I can't believe anyone in this room doesn't know. She's very present in this debate and on Capitol Hill. She holds 3 jobs simultaneously, I think, in addition to what she does at home. So she's president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is sponsoring this event. She's heading up the Campaign to Fix the Debt, which is lobbying for a bipartisan debt reduction plan. And she's the director of the Fiscal Policy Program at the New America Foundation, which is a nonpartisan think tank. In an earlier incarnation, she worked at Brookings and on Wall Street. She's a political independent, and as such, she's advised both Democratic and Republican candidates, and she now works with members of Congress regularly on health, economic, tax, and budget policy. The Wall Street Journal has called her an anti-deficit warrior. Sounds so aggressive. She's very, very nice, though. In any case, she's been one of the most tireless and articulate advocates for Washington to get its fiscal act together, and she's always striving to bring together people from both sides of the aisle to agree on something, to find some common ground. So now I'm going to ask the panelists to make just brief opening statements. I believe Derrick and Jared are going to talk about what they see as the problem that should be addressed, and Jim and Diana and Maya will talk about the solutions that they think make sense. So Derrick, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for having me here and putting me on the far right of the panel.
It was easy.
When we're looking at this problem of our debts, and I think it is a problem, and will be hopefully a recurring theme throughout all of our remarks, as we will acknowledge that it is a problem. Really, another key problem is our economy and getting jobs in the economy on track, and I think they are related in some ways. If you have a larger debt, you have less investment and so forth. But really, I think a lot of the economic growth can best be solved using non-fiscal tools in our toolbox, especially regulation and just clarity on a lot of where we're going to be in a policy perspective so that businesses can plan and so that they can grow in the private sector. So looking at the debt issue, if you look at 12-step programs, the first step is to admit you have a problem. So like I said, I hope that we can all admit that. The U.S. does have a spending and debt problem, and it's actually getting worse, not better, since this recession. The gross debt now stands at 100% of GDP, at about $16.7 trillion, and the public debt is about 75% of GDP, and that's more than twice as high as the historical average. And the research shows that with high levels of debt, you do get lower levels of economic growth, so that's one problem. It also really weakens our ability to survive any shocks, economic or other shocks, if we don't have the ability to use deficit financing in those circumstances. So what I would like to argue is that the current short-term improvement in the deficit, and there has been some, is really fleeting. It'd be a grave mistake to say all is well, we don't need to worry about it anymore. The improvements came really all on the discretionary side and the tax side. So we saw the tax increases in the last day of 2012 or first day of 2013, depending how you look at it. Plus the Fannie and Freddie dividend payments have been really helpful in reducing that, and the sequestration, which is helping on the discretionary side. But even if the sequestration continues, the deficits are going to begin growing again by 2016, and they're going to return to trillion-dollar levels again before the end of the decade under current policy. And that's because we haven't done anything about entitlement spending, which is the biggest driver of our fiscal problems. The Budget Control Act, while it was successful in those discretionary spending programs, does basically nothing on the mandatory side. Entitlement programs are the biggest drivers of spending and debt, especially the health care programs. And we were talking earlier about that, and you can't blame all the health care problems in the world on Obamacare. It's true, but even the CBO report came out this week, showed that Obamacare does increase long-term health care spending. So it is an area that we should look at. It should be on the table as well. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid made up about 45% of the budget in 2013, and they're going to grow to nearly 50% of the budget in just 10 years, and then they grow rapidly from there. Medicaid's costs are going to will double over the decade with the ACA expansion, and really the biggest challenge, I think, and this is where I'll conclude, is long-term unfunded obligations. You're looking at there a staggering total of about $47.5 trillion over a 75-year horizon. So I think it's important that we all talk about the cutting spending, certainly on the discretionary side, but also especially on the entitlement programs so that we can put the budget on a solid fiscal ground. And I think that comports nicely with even the CBO. It's not just the Conservative Heritage Foundation saying, even if you just read the first paragraph of the summary of the CBO report that came out this week, it says much the same thing, that we're on an unsustainable course.
Jared.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. I didn't put my name on it. Sorry, it's a little funky, but I have this one pager, so that's what I'm going to speak from. In the near term, that is basically right now, actually the jobs deficit is a bigger problem than the budget deficit. This is actually not a particularly controversial claim, and many of my, at least, centrist friends have accepted that same point. That and from my perspective, I'm not sure there's agreement on this point, but on my perspective, the budget, the decline in the budget deficit is certainly welcome and not unexpected, given that the worst of the Great Recession is in the rearview mirror. But I would argue that the budget deficit's been coming down too quickly and actually making economic growth a tougher lift. This is a pretty familiar anti-austerity argument. I think that the evidence is quite strong, and I'm happy to speak to it, that austerity measures as currently applied in demand-constrained economies don't work. And by that, I don't just mean that they sacrifice growth. That's obvious. Even the cheerleaders for austerity understand that. But that they don't even help to reduce the debt. So I agree that, that said, that's a near-term issue. I agree with probably everybody on this panel that, at least in the medium term, debt stabilization over the next decade is essential. Our estimates at the Center on Budget is that that would require about $9 billion more in deficit reduction over the next decade, which, by the way, is less than 0.5% of GDP. And that, as I say in my piece, little bullet here, that actually is an estimate that doesn't include sequestration in the baseline. And again, that's a common, for some reason, that's people call that the realistic baseline. I'm not sure that's realistic anymore. But that is a fairly common assumption among some of the wonks who do that sort of work around here. So my point there is that with a functional Congress, which we don't have, but with a functional Congress, that's actually not that heavy a lift to achieve debt stabilization. In the longer term, though, as my colleague said, a sustainable budget path has to pass through a reduction in the rate of growth of healthcare spending. I don't think it's particularly accurate or even helpful to say somebody says healthcare spending is going up. Yes, it's going up. It's going up no matter what we do. Demographically, it's going up. The question is the rate of growth. And here I think there is some hope, and some of it I would even say, and it's not just me, I think nonpartisan analysts have suggested, some partisan, but some nonpartisan analysts have suggested that the recent decline in the growth rate of health savings, an article in the Journal this morning about how health inflation is at something like a 50-year low. Don't quote me on that, but I just quickly saw it on my way in. That some of the recent advances we've made in slowing the growth of healthcare do seem related to some of the kinds of delivery mechanisms that are part of Obamacare. So I actually have high hopes for Obamacare in regard to slowing the growth of healthcare costs, and that's a way in which we clearly differ. And finally, I'm very, very, very concerned about the lack of understanding of these facts that I've outlaid, which and some of my figures, which I didn't get to yet, and I'm saving for the discussion if we get to them, which is that the misunderstanding of everything I've just said by many policymakers and many advocates who have been, I think, excruciatingly and inappropriately anxious about near-term budget deficits, not the medium or the long-term stuff that we all agree, but on the very near term, has contributed to a terrible politics. And it's one that disinvests in our kids. And here I'll just refer to figure 3, which shows the decline in NDD spending as a share of GDP to historical lows. Disinvestment in the next generation, and incentivizes the shutdowns and the default threats that we're struggling with.
Jim.
Good morning, thank you. I guess I'm supposed to talk about solutions, and I do have a secret plan here to to solve the problem. So let me make a couple points about solutions. I can predict without a shadow of a doubt that the solution will not involve in any way the repeal of Obamacare or the delay of Obamacare. Like that is, if I was going to do the 5 fiscal fantasies, that would be number 5. It's not going to happen. I think it is unlikely that we're in a situation in which we're going to achieve something like a grand bargain. I was a grand bargain guy. Third Way, my organization, was a grand bargain organization. In our view, the resolution of the 2012 fiscal cliff, the way that resolved itself, made it very, very difficult for there to be essentially a grand bargain deal. Our belief, and look, I am generally an optimist. People know me, would say this by nature. I'm pretty pessimistic about the next 6 weeks. I was one of the people who said that I think there's a decent likelihood that we'll have a default. I think the government will shut down, and I don't think the Nats are going to make the playoffs. I'm going tomorrow night. I do believe there's an answer. I don't know if anyone's going to take it. In our view, the key to solving this is actually Social Security, which in the grand bargain context of the past, Social Security was always the caboose in any deal. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Oh, no, yeah, we'll do something with Social Security. I think it's now the engine, and the reason is this. It's the only way to get revenue that Republicans will vote for. We've talked to a lot of Republicans' offices. They're no on revenue, but if you say, well, if it's to fix Social Security to make it solvent, they're like, oh, yeah, of course, we would do that. Revenue is revenue. It's the only way to get revenue, and that's something that Democrats want. It does significantly improve the long-range fiscal picture. I know we like to say Social Security doesn't contribute to the debt, et cetera. We have a unified budget. If Social Security gets changed, if we add more revenue, if we change if we do CPI adjustments, et cetera, it changes the long-range forecast. And the third thing it does is it unlocks the key to future deals, because it essentially, maybe not completely, but it takes a lot of revenue off the table. If you looked at the Bowles-Simpson plan, you'd probably get about $650 billion in revenue out of Social Security over the next 10 years. You could do tax reform, both corporate and individual tax reform, in a basically revenue-neutral way. You could do some trading for entitlement fixes to Medicare to do more funding to to discretionary spending. So I think it unlocks those things. And the way it could be done is that you have a commission attached to either debt ceiling legislation or some companion legislation that has the commission report in a date certain with a trigger that says if the commission doesn't report and Congress doesn't vote, the Bowles-Simpson Social Security recommendations come in 2016. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I know some people are talking about this, some Democrats and Republicans, but I think it's there's no room where right now that they're even negotiating in, so it's hard for me to predict what will actually occur. But our view is that that is the key.
Thank you. Diana?
Well, thank you very much for setting up this panel, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate. So I'm also supposed to be talking about solutions, and I would like to propose 2 solutions. First of all, grow the economy, and second, cut spending. So I'd like to just devote just a couple of minutes, a minute or so to each. Everybody knows the advantage of growing the economy. If we move from 2% to 4% growth, we generate more tax revenue, drives down our deficit, drives down our debt. We need to look at why America is not the most business-friendly place in the world. We want it to be the most business-friendly place in the world. We want all companies to come and locate here. It's difficult to do that when our corporate tax rate is 35%, one of the highest in the industrialized world, compared to 24% for an OECD average. Plus, we tax companies' income on a worldwide rather than a territorial basis, like only 7 other countries in the OECD. So we need to bring down our corporate tax rate to a more reasonable level. Canada's is 15%, Germany's is 15%. And we need to tax income on just in the United States, not on a worldwide basis. That could bring in about it can bring in billions of dollars. Billions of dollars in assets could flow back here to be repatriated. And if there was a small tax on that, that would bring in also a lot of funds to the US Treasury. We also need to reform our individual tax code. Again, Americans spend hours doing their tax returns. We need to make it flatter. We need to make it simpler. We also need to have energy reform. We need to make it easier. Regulatory reform, for example, allowing more permitting for energy products and energy projects. So North Dakota has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. Jarrett was talking about the problem of jobs. North Dakota doesn't have that problem. It has a 3% unemployment rate. It's using shale. It's using all its resources. And the interesting thing is that these are all on private lands. For most other states, the shale and the oil are on federal lands. So permitting, getting permission to use these resources is very difficult. We need to make it easier to get those permits, to use our energy resources. We have now permits, export terminals for liquid natural gas. We also need to be able to export some of the oil. North America is turning into the oil exporter, the oil producer. It's turning into the oil producer in the world. We should also be exporting some of these and getting revenue for ourselves. Third, environmental reform. There's no reason that we should be taxing our coal-fired power plants out of existence. Coal produces about 40% of our electricity. The Environmental Protection Agency has just come out last week with rules that would put many coal-fired power plants out of business. Since 2010, already over 100 coal-fired power plants have gone out of business, have folded. And we don't want to neglect this inexpensive source of energy, coal, that we have. Now, this is just part of growing our economy, how to cut spending. As was mentioned before, we need to fix Social Security. If we moved from wage indexing, right now we index Social Security payments to wages in the economy. If we indexed it to prices in the economy, the CPI, that would be a big step towards putting that program in balance. We also need to be raising the retirement age, because if we look at these programs for the elderly, they are getting more and more out of balance because people, very fortunately, are living longer. In July, I became a grandmother. I have a choice. I have a probability of being a great-grandmother. People are living till, 90, 95 is not unusual, but they cannot be retiring at the same age, 65 or 67, and keeping these programs in balance. So we need to be gradually raising the retirement age or raising contributions or lowering payments. But we need to have a serious discussion as to how to keep these programs in balance. Medicare, we need more competition within the program to bring costs down, more like the Federal Employee Health Benefits Program. So seniors can choose programs, they can have a choice of programs, and this will bring down costs. Food stamps, Medicaid, these are programs run essentially by the federal government. They need to be devolved to the states so the states can handle them. Do you know that in many states, there are bingo games to get people to sign up for food stamps? There are ads getting people to sign up for food stamps. That's why 4 years into the recovery, we have 47 million Americans still on food stamps. If we were to devolve the program to the states and say to each state, you take your food stamp money, you figure out who needs it, and you can keep the rest, the programs would not be in the state that they are. The same with Medicaid. Indiana, Rhode Island, they got waivers from the federal government to implement their own Medicaid programs. They have more people on Medicaid and the costs are lower. They have managed to shrink their Medicaid costs. There is no way we can run all these spending programs effectively from Washington. There are many programs on the federal budget that we need to just get rid of. I mentioned briefly energy when it comes in the growth part. But do you know that we're spending $12 billion a year or more on making electricity more expensive? We have subsidies, loan guarantees, tax credits for wind and solar, And maybe they made sense 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, we thought we needed to be energy self-sufficient in order to free ourselves from Middle East dictators. Well, we didn't know we were sitting on all this shale oil and gas. Technology came to our rescue. We're self-sufficient practically with our natural gas and our oil. We don't need to be investing in wind and solar. We also thought that we could help global warming by reducing emissions. Well, we're reducing our emissions every year. The United States is responsible for 16% now of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we reduce it more, we thought that India and China and developing economies would follow suit. Everyone would sign up for the Kyoto Protocol. We would all work together. Well, China and India show no signs of trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So for us to be spending $12 billion a year on these so-called clean technologies, on wind and solar that are far more expensive, won't help global warming unless other countries join in, and we don't see that other countries are joining in. So this is something, you know, it was said when the facts change, we should change our minds. We should take a look at what we are doing with energy. So with that, I'm sure I've spoken more than I should. I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everybody for coming today, and thank you so much to the panelists for joining us. We thought it would be really useful as focus is coming back to fiscal policy after what's been kind of a period of not focusing on it so much, to have a diverse group of people and an informed audience talking about what moments are likely to come up and what we might do about them. Let me just make two observations, and I wish I had solutions. I think I'll talk about what I wish we would do and maybe what we could do. The solutions are certainly not clear at this moment. It seems like a very chaotic period we're entering into.
But I just laid them out, Maya.
Well, there are some solutions here. You can sell that to enough people. No, I mean, the first observation I would say is it's still, just sort of start at the basic, we are operating this country without a budget. And so much of the problems that fall from that are what we're talking about. Because it's kind of inconceivable that we would be running the world's largest economy with no budget. And this isn't even unusual at this point. This is becoming standard. And so that means we don't, as a political system or a country, go through the basic exercise of deciding what's worth spending money on and how you're going to pay for it, and dealing with any of the trade-offs. The notion of trade-offs has kind of been lost in the past years because we spend without paying for it, we cut taxes without cutting spending, we finance everything by deficit. And as a result, you know, I think we're out of practice of actually thinking about what the budgetary trade-offs need to be and should be. So I would just point out that the fact that we're about to figure out whether we should alter the sequester, which I would argue was the wrong way to get spending cuts and savings out of the budget as part of the CR, and possibly shut down the government around it, is not when we should have been having this discussion. We should have been having it as part of the budget. And I would argue the fact that we're going to talk about tying various things to the debt ceiling, including possibly a plan that would help get the debt back on track, is the wrong time to be having this discussion. We should have talked about all of this as part of the budget process. But there has become sort of a given that nothing gets done in Washington until everybody's back is against the wall, and that there have to be action-forcing moments. And it feels like each action-forcing moment now has to be more dangerous than the past one, right? Government shutdowns aren't even a big enough threat. Now we have to talk about threatening default. And it's kind of hard to put those genies back in the bottle. And so one of my brave concerns is that if we don't actually just change the way our budget system works so that we pass budgets before anything else goes on, we're going to be continuing to be stuck in this crisis hopping mode that we're in, just jumping from one crisis to another, with Congress saying we can't possibly make any hard choices unless we actually, you know, can find new ways to hold guns to our own head. And so we should think about how we change that system. The second point I would make is it is astounding to me how few discussions are going on. And we all at this table sit in lots of discussions with different policymakers, and people keep saying, like, not only does everybody say there is no secret plan, there are no secret discussions that are going on, but they say, we don't know who to talk to. And this is both sides saying there's nobody for us to talk to. And it's just astounding that there is no formal discussion as we are hurtling towards shutting down the government and possibly defaulting in this country. which would wreak tremendous havoc through the world economy, that they are not sitting down and trying to figure out how to solve the problem. In no other place would you run without a budget, and in no other place would you be hurtling towards a crisis and not talking about what to do about it. So what should we do?
Turn the bell off.
Yeah. Is there ringing in my head? Okay, good. You know what we think, and I agree with Jim, that the prospects for a grand bargain really are not likely at this point. I still think what we should do is fix the problem of the fiscal challenges, right? We know that our debt is too high. We know that it is a damper on economic growth. We know that the goal here is to get the economy growing again, both in the short term in terms of jobs and making sure that the recovery sticks and making sure that we don't have stupid cuts that can actually derail that. And in the medium and the long term, where we deal with all of the challenges that are driving the national debt, from our living longer, from growing healthcare costs, from spiraling interest costs, which are going to be some of the fastest growing area of the budget, we would get those plans in place in a timely manner so that we had time to make the changes gradually. You don't even have to implement them right away. You want to put them in place right away, phase them in slowly, and give the economy a lot more certainty than we have. A kind of deal that would be big enough to fix the problem would include all parts of the budget. We would look at how you change the savings, I would assume, under the sequester, but where you should be saving money in defense and domestic discretionary and where you should perhaps be spending more. We would look, importantly, at how to make structural healthcare reforms that would keep costs from growing faster than the economy. We're all, I think, hopeful that the changes that we've seen recently stick, but you don't want to bet on it, right? So we know that the combination of growing healthcare costs and the aging of society are pushing healthcare up, and then we know that there needs to be done more, whether it's means testing, whether it's cost sharing, whether it's looking at the retirement age, whether it's delivery system reforms. There are a lot of things that we should be implementing in healthcare. Certainly, Social Security reform has to get done. The sooner we make changes, the stronger that system's going to be. The fact that we've delayed for decades while we have known about the problem is so irresponsible. It threatens the people who depend on the program. And every year that we delay, the costs of making changes become more expensive. I do think we should do it separately from the rest of the budget. I think that's most important for political reasons. And I do think that we should get to work on that immediately. Finally, tax reform. I would agree with the comments that we are an incredibly not competitive economic system because of the ways in which we tax. We could improve the tax system by broadening the tax base. We lose over $1.3 trillion in revenues a year because of tax breaks that we have in the tax system. That is so massive that there's plenty of room to change the way that we give tax breaks. Right now, we pay people to do what they would be doing anyhow, people and companies, what they'd be doing anyhow, or pay them to do the wrong thing, or pay people who don't need it. You can broaden that tax base, bring rates down, raise revenue to help close the deficit. So that's what a grand bargain could look like. I don't think there's time or political appetite to do all of that right now. But what you could think about is if you're not going to go big, can you go medium? Can you come up with something that offsets part of the sequester? Can you come up with something that pays for the doc fix or the SGR, which every year is one of those mini crises we face, and replaces that with smarter healthcare reforms? Can you get started on tax reform? And think about how you might cap tax expenditures or get some savings as we give ourselves more time to work through more fundamental overhaul of the system. And finally, can you put in place, when you do this, I would say, while funding the government for the next year, while lifting the debt ceiling, a process to get the rest of the work done? And I know we've tried over and over again, right? We've had Simpson Bowles, we've had super committee, we've had discussion after discussion. One could look at that as that I don't think any of us really has the stomach for more commissions. But the truth is that many great ideas have been generated from all of these discussions. And so what you really need is to get a lot of discussion on where the political compromises could be. How much entitlements are you going to need for revenues to actually be on the table? The trickiest pieces of that. And so I think that means putting bipartisan, bicameral negotiators in a room who'd like to succeed with this, but giving them a more reasonable time limit than we have with the crises we face right now. So this is a critical moment for this country. I think it feels to me like outside of these discussions, people don't realize how serious both the issues of threatening to default are, and continuing to delay on dealing with our fiscal challenges. There's been a real pullback recently in sort of acting like, well, we've solved some of the problem, we don't need to focus on it. It will really harm this economy for decades to come if we don't get on top of these problems. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to use some of these moments to at least get started.
I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jeanne from CNN Money. I'm Jeanne Sahadi. Maya laid it out perfectly. In fact, you took my first question. That's all right. Given that we are in this dysfunctional moment, and given that we have so much to do, and given that we're not going to have a grand bargain, I was going to ask each of the panelists, except you, Mike, since you just answered it, what you think could be accomplished this fall. If, in fact, and in your case, no one here seems to think Obamacare will be defunded or delayed. So if you don't get that, what can Congress accomplish this fall?
Well, I think Congress needs to have spending cuts. It's just you got to cut spending. The debt ceiling is really kind of like an alarm going off. You know, it's like a smoke alarm going off, and it's supposed to tell you something wrong here. You need to change your course because you continue to spend more than you take in revenue. Pretty simple concept. So they need to take this moment, and they do need to cut spending. Now, most of the spending cuts up to this point, to the extent we've had many, and you can tell kind of from Jared's good slide there that the sequester is just a little tiny sliver there, but it is something, you know, but it's all been on the discretionary side. So I think the spending cuts would probably need to come more from the entitlement side, which is where the longer term problem is.
Would you accept entitlement cuts, though, that do not actually hit until a decade from now? You know, you're not going to get immediate savings from a lot of the entitlements, so would that be acceptable?
Yeah, as long as you put it into law now and it's not an amorphous promise that we'll have cuts 10 years from now. We've seen that before. It never works out, right? You get the tax increases now, for example, and then the spending cuts never materialize, and I think conservatives are very wary about going down that path. But no, if you put into law changes in retirement age or means testing, some of the things we've talked about here, I think that could be a good start.
Jared?
Well, just starting where you stopped, I'm hard-pressed to believe that Congress could endorse entitlement cuts even years down the road without something more in the flavor of the bargains that other panelists have talked about, that is, without something on the revenue side that Democrats would insist on if they were going to accept any entitlement cuts. And it was interesting to hear Jim say, who I think has a good thumb on the pulse, that he thinks there are Republicans who would accept revenue increases if there were cuts he mentioned in Social Security. And there are, I think, some Republican types on this panel who I'd actually like to hear reflect on that. Is that correct? Because if that's correct, that's actually important. One of the, to me, one of the biggest factors behind gridlock and behind the inability to access any kind of bargain has been one side insisting on entitlement cuts and that's it, and the other side insisting on tax increases and that's it. So if there could be some compromise there, that would be notable. I don't think Congress can accomplish that. So to get back to your question.
So far, zero.
Yeah.
So
well, it's a hard question, by the way. I hope you're real. I know you write about this stuff all the time. So it's a hard question. I mean, the conventional wisdom. What can this Congress accomplish? Nothing. So I mean, you'd have to be somewhat blind not to see that. I mean, maybe they could like name a post office, but that's so. So I think that the thing is that what we've typically done in these situations, we've done it like 10 or 11 times now, is we kick the can down the road. And there was an interesting piece by, and that's what they were trying to do. I mean, Eric Cantor had a thing that said, well, we're going to give you a chance to vote on Obamacare repeal, but we'll let the Senate strip it out, and then we'll sort of do this kabuki dance, and we'll kick the can down the road for a few months. At this point, given, and I agree strongly with Maya's concerns about the impact of even getting seriously close to a debt ceiling on the economy, much less breaching, which I think is unimaginable, I would unhappily accept a can kick, because at least we wouldn't be threatening to jump off a precipice. But, as I mentioned, there's this piece by John Weissman in the Times yesterday suggesting that, in fact, the folks who I would say the folks who are very much about repealing Obamacare, what you might call the right wing of the Republican Party, are saying, no, we're not going to do a can kick. We're not going to do gimmicks. So even the can kick doesn't seem to me to be acceptable. So the answer to your question from my perspective, what can Congress accomplish? Maybe at the last minute, the Republican leadership will decide, in the House in particular, that we will go with enough Democratic votes to avoid a shutdown and ultimately a debt ceiling. But that's very much a political strategery question.
Well, just a curiosity, would you accept change CPI as the revenue raiser in Social Security reform? Because there's been a lot of pushback from progressives and liberals on that.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's what you were thinking of, change CPI applied to the tax code in terms of revenues.
That's part of it. It's also some of the lifting of the, moving the payroll cap
higher. Okay, so that's a real rate increase, yeah.
Well, what I'm looking at is just as a default, what Bowles-Simpson said, just as...
Not a rate increase, but yeah, no, I hear you. So to answer your question, the position of the Center on Budget where I work on the change CPI has been that that could be an acceptable change with a couple of very important conditions. One is it would have to be applied to the tax brackets. That's essential. And secondly, there would need, and this was in Bowles-Simpson, by the way, there would need to be some benefit measures to offset the benefit cuts that the change CPI would render on economically vulnerable elderly people. So some kind of offset.
Will you just explain what change CPI is?
Oh,
in case
sure.
anyone doesn't know.
That's a great point. The change CPI is a different way of calculating the price increases to which Social Security benefits are indexed. And it's a way of indexing price increases that grows more slowly than the current price index. So if the price index grows more slowly, then the increase in the benefit adjustments grows more slowly. It's actually a benefit cut relative to current promises because the price index is growing more. Somebody's nodding their head no, but that is, I think, the correct explanation of the change CPI.
Okay. What do you think Congress can accomplish this fall?
I think Jared is overly optimistic. I don't think they can name a post office, but we can argue about that afterwards. I think, I agree with Jared. I think that if all Congress does is kick the can for 12 months, which I think is appalling, that would be a huge victory. Because really, Congress is, domestically, Congress is the only thing standing in the way of a recovery, of a stronger recovery. It's only the things that we're gonna mess up. Look, I think it's possible that in the end there could be some deal in which a Social Security Commission with some sort of trigger down the road that automatically puts in Bowles-Simpson as something that promises some reform. I think that is a possibility. My guess about what's going to happen is I think we'll breach the debt ceiling for a day or two. I think we will then come up with a deal that kicks the can for 12 months because the markets will react horribly, and I think John Boehner resigns as Speaker. That's what I think is what we're looking at over the next couple months.
Cheerful. Diana.
Well, I think the larger problem that we're talking about is that Congress seems to have lost a lot of its power. It used to be in the early 1970s, before the Budget Impoundment and Control Act of 1974, that people would get together in a smoke-filled room, the leaders, they would figure things out, they would get a budget together, and they would pass it. More and more power is going from Congress to the executive. And that's why when you ask, what can Congress get done this fall? I would say there's a lot that Congress could get done this fall if it had the power and if it exerted the power. The problem is that it's not doing that. We see, for example, President Obama has unilaterally taken away the penalties that employers had to pay if they didn't provide health care for their employees under the Affordable Care Act. I mean, just like that, at a cost of billions in revenue. He has waived the requirement that individuals have to verify their income when they are applying for health insurance under the exchanges. He has said that he's not going to deport certain people who are here without documentation, even though that's what the law says to do. You see power increasingly moving from the congressional branch to the executive branch, and Congress just not doing anything.
But Congress does have a job to pass a budget. The president can't pass a budget. That is their job.
Has a job. It still has the jobs that it always had. The problem is that the structure of it is it's not exerting this power. As you said, it's going from crisis to crisis. It doesn't seem to be able to do its just basic job, passing a budget, let alone discussing all these other things that we mentioned. Of course, if Congress wanted to, Congress is in session. It could change indexing of Social Security benefits from wage levels to price levels. Senator Borkus and Chairman Camp, they both say that the corporate tax rate is too high and needs to be cut. There's nothing to stop them doing a bill to do that. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, why isn't Congress doing that? And I think there's just fundamental problems with how Congress operates. And that's what we need to fix. And I'm afraid it's not going to be fixed this fall. So I agree. I don't think Congress is going to accomplish anything this fall.
But so are they going to pass? Are they going to pass any funding? Are we going to get?
They're probably going to
2
pass.
months funding?
They're going to pass some kind of continuing resolution. I mean, that's what they always do. I mean, look what happened just last January. They left everything till the last moment. Then, I mean, they had 2 years to consider what to do in terms of tax reform. It was decided in 2 days between Senator McConnell and Vice President Biden.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sequester. However we get to January, what are your, what should we do with the sequester? Should we replace it with something? Should we let it ride? I'll ask both of you that question, sorry.
Well, I think it's sort of, at least there were spending cuts, period. So if you can replace the spending cuts in a smarter way, I think that's a good step to take, particularly on the defense side, where I think we cut, unfortunately, a disproportionate amount of the cuts were on the defense side. So I think repairing that and making sure that we have the kind of military we need to meet the threats around the world is critically important. There are a lot of other smarter ways to cut.
Where would we replace, how would we replace the defense cuts? Can you give me some?
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of places to cut. We just released a paper with $42 billion worth of cuts identified. It's more a matter of the political will to be able to cut those things. I think food stamps is a good place to start, as Diana pointed out in her opening statement. But I do want to just go back to one thing, which is the whole revenue idea. We just had a massive tax increase. We don't need another massive tax increase. In fact, I was just looking at the president's table in his budget on where receipts are going to go. It's going to be a full percentage point above our historical average since 1960 on revenues. We're doing just fine on revenues. We don't need more revenues. What we need to do is cut spending to a reasonable level. And that's why the sequester, the wrong thing to do would be to increase the spending and get rid of what admittedly were not well thought through cuts. But just getting rid of the cuts without replacing them elsewhere would be a major mistake, because it's at least one little baby step that we've made on reducing spending, which we're going to have to do.
This is kind of interesting in respect to Jim's point and my question that there are even Republican or conservative thinkers on the panel who would definitely raise eyebrows at your assertion that there are Republicans who would be okay with a revenue increase, and we just heard from one. And I don't think your position is atypical. So I'm not saying Jim's wrong, and there's Republicans, but that's what I just heard from my colleague here strikes me as more the dominant position. Just two factual disagreements that we have, and these are the kinds of things where my numbers are even yours, and we can probably hammer this out in some other forum. But our estimates at the Center on Budget show that by a non-trivial margin, the spending cuts that have occurred so far have actually been deeper on the non-defense discretionary side than on the defense side. So we have a factual disagreement there, and I'm happy to share our analysis with anyone here on that. And I don't know if the Maya and your folks have that. You've probably done a similar analysis. So I'd be interested to hear what you found. And then secondly, another kind of factual disagreement is thus far, if you look at the cuts and the tax increases that have been done so far, something to the effect of $2.5 trillion over 10 years, significant deficit savings, 70% have been spending cuts, 30% have been tax increases. So I think that's imbalanced, and I would replace the sequester, as the president would, with something much more balanced in the spirit of what I think Jim was talking about before, which would involve some spending cuts. And the president, by the way, has, and I'm not here to advocate for the president, I'm just saying that there actually is a big Democrat, President Obama, who's put some entitlement cuts on the table. So I think, I personally think many of them are acceptable.
Which ones are those, Jarrett? Which entitlement
So
has the president put on the table?
about, in his budget, there's, I believe, over $300 billion in cuts in Medicare and Medicaid, nothing in Social Security. In Medicare, there are actually premium increases for higher income beneficiaries, and the rest are on the delivery side.
Yeah, it deals with dual eligibles.
Medicare
and
Advantage, you mean?
Medicare Advantage, but more, dish payments and dual eligibles, and basically, rehospitalization
Right.
penalties, things like that. I think they're very good ideas. I think they're exactly the way you do bend the cost curve, as we used to say, to use an unfortunate phrase. So I think that's important. And by the way, as far as Social Security is concerned, I thought Jim and Maya's points on that were well taken. And I certainly could, I've already mentioned that there are ways in which progressives like me, anyway, would be comfortable with some savings there. I guess the one thing I'd say on Social Security, this is a little bit far afield from your question. The answer to your question, in my view, is a balanced replacement that was backloaded. So spending cuts and revenue increases that didn't impinge on the current economy. This is something I just wanted to ask Jim. I think your Social Security thing is interesting, your position that that's sort of the key to unlock things. Most of us envision these graphs that show Social Security stabilizing at 6% of GDP or something, some number of years out, and that the increase in the unsustainable budget is on the healthcare side. So I'm curious as to why you put so much weight on Social Security.
We put weight on Social Security for a couple of reasons. One is, as Senator Durbin has said, fixing Social Security is algebra and fixing Medicare is calculus. So, you can see that there are fixes to be done to make it solvent. We know that solvency needs to be done, and there are ways to do it, and there are ideas out there that are pretty balanced, and, so it's got to be fixed. The second is that we don't believe that there is going to be one or two big, huge Medicare or Medicaid reforms that are going to, tackle healthcare spending that, over the next 20, 30 years. That the way Medicare costs are going to be brought down is over and over and over again, tinkering under the hood that makes changes that I think are pretty holistic. Delivery reform, bundling of payments, dealing with readmissions. I mean, so, for example, I would be happy to trade entitlement cuts in Medicare for more discretionary spending, because our belief is, if you're able to get rid of the $80,000 knee replacement in favor of a $30,000 knee replacement, you're doing something to create more efficiencies in the system that saves money. We don't see that, we don't see that necessarily as a cut. It's a cut for that particular hospital, but there's overpayments going on, and we think that there's just a lot that can be done there.
I think that's a good point. None of us have touched on healthcare spending, and you talked about tinkering there and about efficiency, and something just jumped to my mind, which is there is a system where you don't have to rely on the Congress or the executive branch to do any tinkering, and it's very efficient. It's called the free market. And if we had real healthcare reform that introduced price into the equation, we could go a long way to solving these problems. In particular, I think of the fact that healthcare spending is scheduled to increase. In other words, the demand for healthcare services going up. Anywhere else in the economy, that's great. There's a growth sector. There's somewhere people can invest and earn a profit and so forth. And then if you have real price signals in that, then you can bring additional supply in through additional
Derrick,
investment.
Aren't the exchanges bringing price signals in? I mean, wasn't that actually a heritage idea, the exchanges way back when? I mean, I do feel that, the ACA...
Well, the real problem is the price signal has to be between the consumer and the supplier of the service.
Well, the exchanges are exactly between the consumer and the supplier of the service. I can't think of anything more in healthcare that is more free market than having exchanges where you can choose a whole series of plans.
But you
that are
can't
for
choose
you.
because the floor of the benefits is so high that you're not allowing people a real choice. You're not allowing them to have
agree
a bare bones policy. You're not allowing them to pay more out of pocket. Paying more out of pocket is exactly what we need. At
But there-
Heritage,
I
we
would
have an
just note
HSA, and our
there-
healthcare costs have
that
been
would be-
basically flat.
That would be a very, I think, positive reform to allow people to have a less than bronze plan out there. I think that is a very reasonable reform. It would be nice if we were focusing actually on reforms of the ACA, which after Part D, Democrats hated Part D, but we reformed it a bunch of times. Now everybody loves it. There are some things with ACA that I think can be fixed. I wish Democrats and Republicans would get together and fix it and get rid of this fantasy that it's going to be repealed. Yes, if Rand Paul becomes president and you get 58 votes in the Senate and can pick 2 Democrats off, maybe you can repeal the thing, but that's what we're talking about.
Diana, how would you replace the sequester?
Well, I would replace the sequester by cutting spending. And as far as the Affordable Care
But
Act goes,
specifically, how would you, where would you cut it? Because we have cut a lot on the discretionary side, and again, the entitlements would come later. in the
Sequester
day.
is a spending cut. So it's
Well,
like,
to replace your,
so which, yeah. you're
replace
asking-
so if I
That's the
couldn't,
question.
I would cut these alternative energy programs that are about $12 billion a year. I would take various entitlement programs that we have, and I would devolve them to the individual states and let them structure the programs as they wanted. I would take the Highway Trust Fund, devolve that to the states, so the gas tax revenues wouldn't be coming to Washington, and then Washington deals them out and then sends them back to the states with a whole list of requirements. I would say to the states, you can levy the gas tax if you want. You raise your revenues for your own highway and road spending however you want. And by the way, you don't have to take 20% of the revenues and use it for mass transit when only 2% of Americans ride mass transit. We have so much waste in the system. And the idea that we cannot cut enough to replace the amount taken away in the sequester, which was just a drop in the bucket, about $80 billion this year, is just ludicrous. There's lots of places, defense, non-defense, these different kinds of programs. Unemployment insurance should go back to, for example, 26 weeks. Now the average is about 55. But as far as making healthcare spending more efficient, in terms of cutting rehospitalization reimbursements, this just discourages hospitals from taking really sick people. They're just going to carve out the people who they think will be cured and then not be readmitted. It's not an example of an entitlement reform because these individuals are still entitled to go back to hospitals. It's cutting reimbursements to doctors and medical providers, which is going to weaken our health system. And I would say in terms of competition, the idea that the Affordable Care Act provides competition, again, is just absurd because everybody has to offer the same plan. They have to offer the bronze plan. So catastrophic health insurance where people shop around, that's only available to people under the age of 30. Why not have those plans be sold to everybody? I mean, these were low-cost plans, and they are being prohibited under the Affordable Care Act. And again, as an example of the messing around with the labor markets, why say that full-time is 30 hours a week? Why not say it's 40 or 50 hours a week? Because right now we're forcing employers, we're not forcing them, but employers are being incentivized to replace one full-time person with 2 part-time people. It's very tough on the job market. It's very tough on low-wage workers who are then having their hours cut and have to go out and find supplementary jobs. There's many things that we could do to fix the Affordable Care Act and make it more competitive. And one would be to say any plan could be on the exchange. The plans, not just the plans approved by the federal government and laid out under the Affordable Care Act.
So just to be clear, so you're amend it, don't end it when it comes to Obamacare?
I think that there are many fixes we could do. Well, my first preference would be to end it, but there are many things we could do in the meantime that would make it much more workable. And one of them would be to say any plan can be listed on the exchange, including catastrophic health plans. and let individuals choose. And another would be to get rid of the employer penalties. I mean, here we're surprised that employment isn't growing. And yet, when an employer moves from 49 to 50 workers, if he doesn't offer the right kind of health insurance, he has a fine of $40,000 a year. So there are, of course, a lot of small businesses who are saying, we got to stop at 49 workers, no way we're going to get to 50. If we need to have revenue for the Affordable Care Act, we shouldn't do it by a tax on employment, because as we all know, when we tax something, we get less of it.
And I would just add, I think Diana's list of programs was great. And there's also a lot of traditional, more Republican constituencies that there are places to cut there. For example, the Farm Bill. You know, we at Heritage wrote a lot about the waste in the Farm Bill. That's a place to cut. And another is the corporate welfare. I think of the Export-Import Bank and other places like that. I know Diana's written about too. So there's places to cut all around. Everybody could use some cuts.
Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We have all these, cable TV stations. Why do we need a public TV station?
Okay, you tell them how much that would save.
No, so actually, I think a lot of the specifics that have been put on the table are great because we have been talking about specific policies, and there's actually some head nodding among the panelists on a bunch of them, which is helpful and sort of optimistic. Right, whenever you just talk about corporate jets and oil and gas subsidies, you know that somebody's not willing to talk about the real places that you get savings. But what I think you've heard here is more potential savers. Just on the sequester, I think one thing, at least how I look at it, is we should replace it with much smarter cuts. But I don't think we have to replace all of it. So one of the questions is sort of how much could you still take out of defense and domestic discretionary? One of the problems with spending caps is that you just talk about it in top-line numbers, and you never have to identify what that means to the actual program. So it's very hard to say, well, the right amount is to keep $300 billion of the sequester and replace the rest. My guess is $300 billion may be the range of the right amount, but you really need to get more specific. I wanted to kind of jump from that into what I think is the biggest question in all of this, which is revenues or no revenues. And it seems to me, I'll take whatever works at this point, but it seems to me that if we just are trying to replace the sequester, it's going to end up being just spending cuts for spending cuts. You're going to have different kinds of spending cuts replacing the current spending cuts. I don't think there's going to be any openness to having revenues as part of sequester replacement.
I agree. I think we need more revenues. And I want to be on the record that we need more revenues. But I don't think that tax rates should be raised. If we were to lower our corporate tax rate, some of the $1.7 trillion in assets that are being held outside would be coming back in. That would give us more revenues. If we were to lower capital gains tax rates, that would give us more revenues. So I'm in favor of lowering the rates to get us more revenues.
Okay, so
Scientific taxation.
But there are folks at tax analysts who might disagree with that in terms of what they don't think it would bring in nearly as much revenue as the promise holds out, simply because companies, are going to make, they're not, let me just stop. There are tax,
first of all, they look at static rather than dynamic scoring. But secondly, it's common sense. Anyone can realize that when we are the highest taxed jurisdiction in the industrialized world, and we tax companies on their worldwide income rather than just domestic income, there is money that is going to be out there that we are not going to get. Everyone has to realize that we're going to get more money if we fix this problem. I mean, when our neighbor to the north has a corporate tax rate of 15% and ours is 35%, and the OECD average is 24%, and we are 35%, something's wrong here.
Would you recommend then getting rid of lots of tax expenditures to help pay for that? Because even though we have the highest nominal rate, in terms of real taxes paid, we're low on the scale. So would there be that trade-off?
Right, I would recommend getting rid of some, but for example, when we talk about oil and gas tax breaks, and the major oil and gas tax break is the domestic manufacturing deduction. That applies to all manufacturing, and the oil and gas share is less. They get less of a domestic manufacturing deduction than the other companies. I would say, if you want to get rid of that for oil and gas, get rid of it for all domestic manufacturers. I wouldn't be picking on the oil and gas sector.
So can I
wait, can I
Oh,
finish?
sure.
So just 'cause my second point would be that while I think the right way to do this is to do it comprehensively and do everything all at once, that's not what we have been doing. We have been doing this piece by piece by piece. And to steal a line that I heard Erskine Bowles say, we've done all the easy things, and we've done a lot of stupid things, and we haven't done the hard things yet. But so if you look at what we've done the caps on domestic and defense, and we've raised revenues, but what we haven't done is entitlements. So if we continue to go in this piecemeal way, which I don't think is how we should do, the next place to focus on is going to be entitlements. And I think the conclusion from that is if all we come up with is a small deal and it has some entitlements or some entitlement replacement for sequester, you're not going to see an openness to revenues. But if we do what I think you have to do to actually solve the problem, which is, again, look at all these pieces, and the fiscal cliff deal just made it so hard because this number of $600 billion in revenues, I think you couldn't have picked a worse number because it's enough for Republicans to say, we have already paid, we are done with taxes. And it's enough for Democrats to say, you have got to be kidding. Boehner's first offer was $800 billion. We collected $600 billion. It's absurd to say that we're done. And so the arrangement that we came up with at the end of last year really did make this discussion more difficult. But my sense is, and I agree with Jim, that there are lots of people who understand you can't possibly get this done in terms of getting us back on a sustainable fiscal path without some revenues. I think those revenues have to be coupled with structural entitlement reforms. I don't think that has to be as far as premium support. There may be disagreement about that, but things that will really put our entitlements on sustainable footing. And I think it does have to come from tax reform instead of rates. One of the big questions, I think, is what you were alluding to is, can that tax reform actually generate revenues, or can it only be the dynamic piece of it that generates revenues? And there'll be some discussion about that. If people only say it can come from dynamic growth, I think you have to find a way to ensure that that happens. And that's a big challenge, which is, can you say if revenues are supposed to be this amount, if they fall short, there would be some kind of tax trigger that made sure you collected the extra amount. It's just designing that trigger is quite complicated.
Yeah, that's the point I was gonna make, that even if you believe the dynamic set of, the dynamic impacts that Diane was advertising, the CBO won't score them. And so you would be, and I think to their credit, so we have a substantive disagreement about the impact of those cuts. So you'd either need the Maya mechanism, or more realistically, I think you'd need to say where you were going to, which loopholes you were going to close on the expenditure side. I wanted to make one other point, and again, I thought, Maya, you sort of started by saying we can replace the sequester with other discretionary cuts, and then you went to entitlements. And I was just going to say that there was a slide from the presentation that CBO Chief Doug Elmendorf gave the other day that I thought was kind of interesting, where he showed as a percent of GDP, basically where the budget pressures are coming from. And actually, if you look over time, based on kind of what's baked in the cake, you really don't see much coming from anything that isn't entitlements or interest payments. So I don't really think there's much traction at all on the discretionary side, maybe on the defense, I don't even know. I just don't think there's much traction at all in terms of a sustainable budget by targeting discretionary. I just don't think you're going to get.
My point from that just comes from basically with any budget and any part, there's some savings that you can have. So I think I think the benefit of spending caps is that it makes us actually look more closely at the programs, whether we're spending money in the right places in the best ways, and it puts some pressure, and there's a point when the pressure is too high. The point I would make is a little bit less that there's not more savings to generate from there, but that there's probably some areas we should be spending more on.
I would just say that our current experience contradicts the idea that somehow budget caps impose intelligent discipline.
But we didn't allow for much flexibility so far.
Well, in terms of entitlements, we should be looking at dialing back some of these entitlement programs just to 207 levels. I mean, if we look at food stamps, for example, food stamp payments were raised by $80 a month for a family of 4 in the stimulus bill. We have yet to dial them back. Unemployment insurance used to be a maximum of 26 weeks in 207, went up to 99 weeks, average is now 55 weeks. We need to dial that back down to 26. EITC, apparently 25% of EITC payments go to people who don't really deserve them because we don't check very thoroughly. And in terms of the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, President Obama has just waived the income verification that's necessary in order to get discounted health care premiums.
But just about that, there is a back check. Once you file your taxes, the IRS will have verification as to whether you deserve the subsidy that you got if it was too much. There is there is a back check to it. It's just in that first year, they're just taking one administrative thing. They're lessening the administrative load for 1 year for the exchanges as they get set up. But
So
you will find out when
in 2014, you
file your
don't have to
return.
provide verification, and then you file your tax return in April 1st, 2015. Then the IRS has perhaps finished checking it by, I don't know, the end of the year. Then they're going to go back to people and say, give us more money. You think people are
No,
going
I
to give
think
it to them?
it's in the context of the return you file, that it will be,
The return you file for 2014.
For
you're gonna
2014,
You're
right,
going to
so-
file that April 15th, 2015. So then by the end of 2015, the
We're in
IRS is
April.
going to come back to you and say, we want the money back.
they,
People are going to repay it
or they could reduce your refund. They could, there are other ways.
if you have a refund.
If you have a refund, yeah.
People are soon going to learn that they're not going to, they're going to underpay and then pay extra so that they don't have the IRS taking them.
I'm not saying it's, I'm not saying
Very
it's
complicated.
pleasant. Yes, a lot of things in the AC are complicated, that's true. Let's open it to the audience. In fact, that nice gentleman, are there microphones, or if there's not, you should speak up, maybe stand up even.
Yeah, there's microphones.
So the gentleman right here down the aisle.
Okay, just a question for Mr. Kessler. Can you explain, I was listening to your thoughts about what's going to happen this fall. Can you explain why you think we're going to have a shutdown, why you then think we're going to breach the debt ceiling, and then why those people will resign? Explain the politics of this. And this seems like a very...
I know, and it's not normally, really, it's not normally my nature on this. I'm such an...
I keep hearing people say, I'm usually an optimist,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Don't we keep-
To me, the Republican path is folly, okay? And
Has fallen?
is folly,
Folly.
you know? And, you know, this path about defunding Obamacare is, you know, I don't want, look, I don't want to use pejoratives, but I mean, it's close to insanity, okay? And it seems to me, just from my vantage point, that there is nobody in control of the Republican caucus on the House side. And it also seems to me that the only way that we're going to get to a solution is for Boehner to break the Hastert rule again, which means the Hastert rule is that don't bring anything to the floor unless there's majority Republican support within the conference. And he's done it a couple times, and my belief is he won't do it until it's an absolute crisis, because there's no answer. The crisis will hit, and he'll say, okay, I warned you that this was going to happen, we're going to do it, and I'm going to go down on the ship with it. I think he'll be replaced. That's my view.
Can I,
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they might, is there a way to do it without breaking the Hastert rule? There probably is, but I don't see that path right now. And would he break the Hastert rule at 11:50 p.m. the, you know, before, and we avoided debt ceiling? That's very possible, but I also think that it's possible that we don't.
Can I make a couple of comments just quickly? There was an interesting quote in an article this morning in the Post by, the byline was Lori Montgomery, where one of the Republicans who is kind of looking to go over the, whatever cliff they see, they'll jump over it, said, I don't care what, there's something like this, but you should get the actual quote. It was very bold. Is that I don't care what the leadership wants. I care what my district wants, and my district wants me to block Obamacare.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty powerful. Secondly, I just want to,
Politics is local.
I
Politics
just,
is local.
yeah, but like it didn't used to be that local, and I think that's a very interesting. There's this very interesting set of questions. Is it because there are less earmarks to give out, and so you can't control it, folks, or there's different sources of money? It's a very interesting political science question as to the evolution of our dysfunction. I just want to underscore a point that Maya blew by very quickly earlier, which is really profoundly at the root of all this, which is that we don't have a budget. The debt ceiling, as we all know, I hope we all know, is paying debts that you've already incurred. I mean, this is, you're sitting around picking your teeth and deciding if you want to pay the bill for the food you just ate. The budget is when you're looking at the menu, and that's when you decide whether you're willing to support future spending. So I think the absence of a budget here is extremely profound.
Right. It all comes to the decline of Congress as an effective institution. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in. And I think, unfortunately, that's more than we can fix on this panel today.
Yes, sir. You over here. Oh, good. They have mics. That's helpful.
Ramon Buehler with the Madison Coalition. I was a committee counsel for Congress for 14 years. And what I observe is that there's broad agreement on this panel on two things. One, we have a debt problem long term. And the second of all, you all seem to be relying on Congress to fix the problem. And yet most of the country understands, I think correctly, that Congress is completely and totally dysfunctional on this subject. So my question to any of you that want to comment is, what do you think of the idea that the solution is not to trust Congress to solve this problem, but to empower states to use Article 5 to impose constitutional fiscal discipline on Congress? 70 to 80% of the people in the country support what they describe as a balanced budget amendment. Now, whether it's a balanced budget amendment or a fiscal discipline amendment that limits excessive borrowing is a detail. But if Congress can't solve the problem, what do you think of the idea of empowering states to force Congress to do it by proposing a specific amendment that has bipartisan support? Then Congress will propose the amendment, because I don't think anybody in Congress wants a convention.
Does anyone want to answer that?
Well, I think a balanced budget amendment can be constructed so it would be better than what we have right now. It would have to be constructed so the spending is linked to some measure of revenues maybe 3 or 4 years ago, because right now Congress, in its budgeting for the fiscal year 2014, does not have the revenues we're going to get in 2014. So it's very difficult to construct a balanced budget. But if it were empowered to spend a multiple of what was collected, for example, if we had the revenues for 2012, which we get finally in October, we have some better idea. Also, there would have to be some kind of fund set aside for emergencies. So if there was some kind of emergency, then that fund can be drawn on. But much as Congress is dysfunctional, I don't know if there are the votes in the states to pass that amendment, even though, you know, theoretically, I think it would be superior to what we have right now.
The other point I would just make is that you'd want to be really careful to not empower judges to make fiscal policy on the tax or the spending side. That would be, so what's the enforcement mechanism there? And that would be, as a person who is leery of judicial overreach, I'd worry about that a little bit too.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask a question about tax reform. I think there's sort of general agreement that tax reform would be good if we could get it. And by that I mean base broadening, which would lower the rate. I mean, that's everybody seems to accept that. We're getting there. While I'm generally an optimist, I don't see how we get there now. But and now we're getting hung up on whether tax reform is going to raise revenue or not raise revenue. You don't really know that until you see the rate structure you apply to the new tax base. Why do we get hung up on why don't we start doing something together, tax reform, that is, broadening the base, and then you can have 3, 4, 5, 6 rates. One raises a lot of revenue, one raises no revenue, one loses revenue, pick the tax rate you want. And we can get started on at least doing something on tax reform. But nobody seems to, you don't know how much tax reform is going to raise unless you know what the rate structure is going to look like. And we all agree the tax base broadening.
Could you get the microphone in front of him?
Yeah, could you give him the mic? Because other people.
And we all agree that well done tax. Been talking for 10 minutes.
He was saying, why set a revenue target for tax reform? We're not going to know how much revenue is going to be raised by tax reform.
The tax reform basically is, everybody agrees, it really looks at it seriously, is to broaden the tax base, which necessarily will let you lower the rates and raise the same amount of revenue on a broader tax base. Or you can not lower the rates that much and raise a little revenue. In other words, you will not know how much the tax reform will raise until you know what rate structure you're going to put on that new tax base. And you have that option later. And that can be the political fight, not whether you do tax reform, because tax reform, generally agreed, is going to help the economy seriously.
Maya, do you want to?
Sure. So I should say what Buck didn't say because he didn't introduce himself, and he probably wouldn't have said this anyhow, but he's one of the leading tax reform experts in the country and has been involved heavily in the past. So not surprisingly, I think his insights are thoughtful and useful. I do think that there is such a need for tax reform, and that the question of is it going to raise revenues or not is going to just be a huge hurdle that we'll have to get over at some point. But the House and the Senate are very different, right? And so if we let them both go on different tracks, where the House is doing one version of tax reform, the Senate is doing another version, and they're both focused on the base broadeners, and they may come up with different rate structures, I actually think that would be a very helpful thing, because what you'd start to understand is that while broadening the base is really difficult and has a lot of things that people don't want to do in it, there is tremendous benefit of it to the overall economy and to taxpayers if you're simplifying the tax code, but more importantly, if you're coming up with a tax code that's far more sane, pro-growth, and has rate reduction in it, they can differ over what that rate structure is. So I think that's probably the best way that tax reform could move, but there is no way that Democrats want to say, we are opening the door for tax reform that doesn't raise revenue, because from their perspective, that's the best shot you're going to get at more revenue. It shouldn't be.
You mean raise rates, not raise revenue.
No,
No,
raise revenue.
Raise revenue.
Set a revenue target.
No, you don't want to raise rates. And Democrats, I think, should be convinced and need to be convinced that they can raise revenue, not by raising rates, but in fact by lowering rates, but keeping some of the base broadening measures for deficit reduction.
There also seem to
Like
be
more
some
revenue.
Democrats who want to insist on raising rates.
There are, and I think that that's an unfortunate fight. I think if the fight goes to that we have to raise rates to raise revenue, which is what we did in the fiscal cliff, we will get nowhere. I think it's not the right way to do it for the economy, and I think it's not the right way to do it politically. But if you focus more on getting the revenue from broadening the base and using some of that money, which is $15 trillion over the next decade, talking about tremendous pool of money, there is money there to both lower rates and collect more revenue for the government. And I think in there is a possible compromise.
Well, I got to say, I mean, I might have agreed with that at some point, but and maybe you're right, but I think Baucus and Camp have been spectacularly unsuccessful thus far in their campaign, and they've run into this buzzsaw of, oh yeah, sure, get rid of that, of all the loopholes you want, but not mine. And you know, that's an obvious problem, and it's one that we somehow managed to, I think, get around to some extent in the '86 reform, but that was a different time, and there was more of a sense of we're willing to make some sacrifices here for lower rates and for the greater good, as it were. I wanted to make one other point, but it...
Wait, but can I ask you a question? Because that's a political reason not to do it, right? It's going to be really hard, just like entitlement reform would be really hard. But would you agree that it would be smarter to raise revenues from broadening the base instead of raising the rates?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think most economists would agree with that. But it's not, I mean, you can call it a political problem, but if we're talking about tax reform, we're talking about political problems. And
we're talking about any fiscal improvements. We're talking about political problems, I'm afraid.
Sorry?
I mean, all of the things that we're talking about needing to do are really, really hard. So
Correct.
This is one of the very hard things. that has to be done.
And you're right. You know, the fact that it's hard is not a great insight. But my point is that I do agree with you, and as someone who's more on the progressive side of this, that in fact, maybe I'm disagreeing with your premise here, that I very much would be wary of going into any tax reform negotiations that didn't involve higher revenues at the end of the day, and scored.
Can I just make a point?
Sure.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, and I see that there's reluctance to do it. But a given to me is if you restructure the base, you will have lower rates.
Mm-hmm.
The only question is how much lower. And so would it bother you if you said, I'm not going to agree to this if the rates aren't substantially lower, and then argue later on how much substantially? I mean, that's a dumb question. I'll withdraw that. But what you're really saying is tax reform is not possible, and I think that may well be true, but it is really a bad sign for the economy if that is true, because the tax system is really hurting the economy now.
You know, I'm probably less wound up about the tax system than you are, but you probably know it better than I do. So that may be the issue. One thing I remember. The other thing I wanted to say was, you know, I think the White House, people can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think the White House has said that they would do revenue neutral corporate tax reform.
Business tax reform.
Business tax reform. So, and you're not going to get to Diane's 15, but you might get to something between her and, I don't know, me. So perhaps there's some traction there.
You had a question, sir.
Yeah, what we've really been discussing is a political problem, not really a policy problem. There are policy solutions. The U.S. solved a major deficit and budget problem in the 1990s. The Democrats led the way. I think it's fair, though, to credit Ross Perot, an independent, for putting it on the national agenda in 1992. He was eccentric, et cetera, but I think the country owes him a debt of appreciation for that. If the two major parties in this country are utterly failing to do a budget, to pay our bills, to come up with any kind of normal system, and it's endangering the economy and the credit of the country, isn't it time for some political and independent political movement to save us?
Well, I'm going to guess that I'm probably the only person on the panel who actually at one point flew down to see Ross Perot to say we needed him to come back. So it was a pretty cool visit because I got to see his charts were like taped on the walls, and that was neat. I think, I mean, I'm not sure if that's the specific answer. I happen to be someone who is kind of interested in it and thinks it has some appeal. I think there's absolutely no question that you're not going to get the full fiscal reforms until we have political reform. We've heard so many ways about how Congress is broken. I think there are so many parts of the political system, whether it's money, where it's just redistricting, that cause this to be a huge problem. And I do think that if neither party is able to kind of work through this on its own, there's a leadership void right now, but there's also kind of a messaging void. And as somebody who sits in the center, I know that there are a lot of people out there who are desperate for the message of we want to fix problems, we want to work together, compromise is not a bad word. And so, you know, I worry that it's going to take us a long time to make the big structural changes that need to happen to get this done, but I think the problems may be that deep.
And can I just jump on that too? There's a bunch of people who deserve credit. 1990 Bush budget deal, which, you know, was difficult for him and his own party. That mattered. The 1993 budget deal that Democrats did all on their own, that was difficult, but it mattered. There was a future deal, I think it was 1996, with that Clinton did with Newt Gingrich. And I agree, there was a lot of pressure and right, I think that it was very important, but I thought both parties showed a lot of courage, and I think Ross Perot was a big part of that as well.
Well,
is our political system...
In the 1990s, it was the Republicans that sent Clinton these balanced budgets, which he signed. They also sent him welfare reform at least
in 1993, I was there. That 1993 budget bill, there didn't get a single Republican vote, and it put us on a path to, and I remember what the Republicans were arguing again, it was going to explode the deficit, it was going to kill growth, and it did neither of those things. And then, yes, they kept sending these but the budget deal in 1996 was so easy because our economy was growing so fast, in part thanks to what Bill Clinton was doing. So let's not go overboard about how the Republican Congress in 1996 really sealed that deal. 1990 was big, 1993 was bigger, 1996 was icing on the cake.
In 1993, even the Democrats wouldn't pass the budget that Clinton wanted. Lloyd Bentsen wouldn't pass it because it was too big.
But we ended up passing something. I remember it really well.
We didn't pass what
I was working there.
The Clinton budget passed, the Obra 92 or 93, but it passed by one vote, I think.
Yes. Marjorie Margolis-Mezvinsky
right.
was the one vote,
That's right.
according to legend.
We have time for one more question. The gentleman who's waving his finger.
We talk about Congress like it's a separate entity, but isn't, in fact, major part of the problem is the country is just very severely divided, and Congress, to a great extent, is reflecting a lot of that division?
I think that's part of it, but another part is that we have got used to this deficit financing. It used to be when we had Graham-Rudman-Hollings, at least there was a pretense of trying to pay for what we spent. Now there is not even a pretense. We're just used to the deficits, we're just used to the debt, and we think we can just go on spending ad infinitum with nothing to stop us.
Yeah, I think we've gotten the government that we've chosen.
I mean, I think both some of the comments that you that were just made and your comments as well, I had the following thought. As you've seen from my, as I hope you've heard from my comments and my presentation, I am mindfully concerned and unified with many on the panel vis-a-vis medium-term and particularly longer-term budget pressures, which I think is largely a healthcare story, partially which may be we making some progress on. But I want to say, both to the gentleman who spoke, the budget deficit, according to yesterday's CBO report, is supposed to be something like 2% of GDP in 2015. That's primary balance. The debt as a share of GDP is going to start coming down soon temporarily. Now, then it's going to start going up. So I'm not saying we're out of the woods, but I'm saying this idea that we've somehow been on a drunken sailor spending spree is certainly not reflected in medium-term numbers, I mean in near-term numbers. What we have done is gone through a very deep recession and kicked spending and deficits up a lot, but they are coming down significantly. I don't want you to lose that in the context of what you're hearing.
And I would just kind of a geeky political science point, but a colleague of mine at Heritage pointed this out a couple years ago, that we crossed a interesting line when there were no longer any Democrats that were more conservative than any Republicans in the House. And that's true in the Senate as well. And it's interesting that political scientists back in the 60s and 70s kind of lamented the fact that the parties aren't really ideological enough and there's not really a choice for the American people. So I guess there's no perfect solution for political scientists, because now we basically have two parties that are much more ideologically sorted.
So I would just add that to Jared's point, sort of in the context, everything he said is true, and I agree with him in that we should be pleased that there have been some fiscal improvements in the short term. But the other side of that context is our debt is still so much higher than it has been historically, and that's a real problem because it leaves us vulnerable. We don't have the kind of fiscal flexibility that we've had in the past, and we have the risk that the debt at this level is already a drain on economic growth. So while it's coming down, it's still starting from a point that's much too high. And on the question about Congress versus voters, I wonder about that all the time, sort of the chicken and egg part of this. My non-political expertise on it makes me believe, though, that this is a kind of issue where, one, we have become accustomed to deficit financing, and even if I don't want a new spending program or a tax cut, if somebody offers me one, I'm going to be pretty happy to have it, right? Overall, sort of the freebies have been something we've gotten used to, and it's a bully pulpit issue. We're not going to be able to really have the country understand, one, why making real changes to programs that people like, Social Security and Medicare, are in the best interest of those programs, and two, why having a debt that's so high is really connected to our lives, because it's not a kitchen table issue, and you need somebody who can explain why it matters to us in our daily lives. And I look at that as a leadership issue, that it's not going to be able to change unless you have the leadership that's willing to explain to the country why these things matter so much. So I think we all play a huge role in it. I really do think voters play a huge role in it, but I think there has to be somebody at the top, or many somebodies at the top, who are making the case to the country so we can sort of come to the understanding of why it's so important.
I think that'll be the last word. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to the panelists.
Thanks to our moderator.
Thank you. You're great.